J. Jackson 99.5,
WEVF, Colebrook 90.3,
and WEVQ, Littleton 91.9.
And online at nhpr.org.
From New Hampshire Public Radio, I'm Laura Knoy, and this is The Exchange. UNH President James Dean wants to vault the university into the nation's top tier of public higher education, and at the same time, as he says, make Granite Staters wicked proud of UNH. Dean has been on the job for half a year now. He presented his agenda last week in a speech called The Future of UNH. Today in The Exchange, we dig into the new priorities he outlined and cover long-standing issues regarding the university, its low state funding, its high tuition, and its lack of student and faculty diversity. Let's hear from you, too, especially if you have connections to UNH. What's already great about our state's flagship university? What would make it better? Our email, exchange@nhpr.org. Again, exchange@nhpr.org. Respond on Facebook or Twitter at NHPR Exchange, or call in 1-800-892-6477. And in addition to listening to our show today, you can watch it on Facebook Live. President Dean, it's really nice to meet you. A belated welcome to New Hampshire.
Thank you very much, Laura. I appreciate it.
Well, when you talk about your background and going around the state, introducing yourself to people, you often mention, President Dean, that you were the first in your family to go to college. Why is that important to you that people know that?
Well, we have, a lot of students at UNH and in the system as a whole who are first-generation college students. And I think showing them that I am a first-generation college student helps them to see that not everybody comes from a background with a lot of educated parents and family and so on, and that you can certainly have a wonderful life and career wherever you've come from. And I feel very grateful, and also that education has helped to get me where I am, and it helps so many students to get them where they are.
And you talk about the importance of education. Do you feel that we are at a time, President Dean, where people are wondering about the value of a college education? Because we'll talk later, it's very expensive.
Yes. It's a funny irony, actually, of the two things that are going on now. One is that the value of a college education, and by that I mean a bachelor's degree, has never been higher. And in fact, the lifetime earnings of someone with a bachelor's degree is roughly $1 million greater than someone who does not have a bachelor's degree. They also contribute more to society in many ways and draw less on public services in many ways. So there's both public and private benefits that are huge and probably never bigger for reasons we can get into if you want. At the same time, recent surveys have shown that vast segments of the population has doubt about the value of college education. And that's kind of hard to square with the incredible economic value that it provides both for individuals and for society as a whole. Interestingly, if it's sort of like people's perceptions about Congress. If you ask them about Congress as a whole, they say they don't get anything done. And if you ask them about their individual legislators, they think they're great. So that's the same with higher education.
Where did you go to college, President Dean? And what was that like for you to sort of be the groundbreaker in your family?
I went to Catholic University, formerly the Catholic University of America, which is in Washington, in Northeast, where I'm from. And, I was breaking new ground. My mom was from Pennsylvania, from the coal mining region of Pennsylvania, and she had to leave to get a nursing degree, and eventually there really weren't any jobs where she was from. It was in the anthracite region, and that was mostly gone. So she came down to Washington to get a job after going to nursing school. And my dad grew up in D.C., and he made it through high school. He went to Gonzaga, which is a pretty well-known Catholic high school in Washington, and eventually came back and got kind of a junior college degree in accounting that allowed him to move up a little bit within the government. But I was breaking new ground, going to a 4-year institution and living away from home and so on. And my parents were incredibly supportive, and that sort of continued as I went on through graduate school, that they were my champions. I'm deeply grateful for that.
It's nice to hear. Well, how did you pay for it? Because, there's so much emphasis now on the cost and student debt, and you well know that New Hampshire students have the highest debt loads in the country. I'm just wondering how you juggled it coming from that modest background.
Well, I don't want to pretend that we were poor.
Yeah.
We were certainly in middle class. And so my parents, I did work it out one time, I think just after I graduated, that I paid for about half my college expenses and my parents paid for the other half. And I worked in one way or another the entire time I was in college.
All 4 years.
Yeah. My my first year, I actually had a job with what was then the General Accounting Office. It's now the General Accountability Office in Northwest. So I would take classes 3 days a week and work for the government 2 days a week. And then the subsequent years, I had jobs on campus of various kinds, work study, everything from keeping score at baseball games to cleaning things up around the gym. I also worked in campus ministry at Catholic U for the last couple of years. And so I learned a lot that way as well.
Yeah, you patch it all together somehow. I want to remind our listeners, President Dean, that they can join us with your questions and comments. Again, today in the Exchange, UNH President James Dean, he's on the job just 6 months, so it's your chance to ask him your questions or give him your thoughts about UNH. 1-800-892-6477. Send us an email, exchange@nhpr.org. So, President Dean, you came here after just about 2 decades at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. What drew you to New Hampshire and to UNH? What made this an appealing switch? Because, UNC Chapel Hill is not a shabby school.
No, it's certainly not. I had reached the point where I thought that my next career move should be to be a college president. And so I was in touch with a number of executive search firms or headhunters in the vernacular. And one of them called me about this job and asked me if I'd be willing to go to the first interview, the so-called airport interview. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to. And I did some homework enough to try and be credible in the first interview. But something really interesting happened in that first interview. I was completely blown away by the affection and dedication that the people in the search committee had for UNH. And it reminded me a little bit of the way that people in North Carolina feel about UNC. And by the end of that interview, based on seeing that, I went from, okay, I'm willing to go to the first interview to I really want this job. So it was an amazing transformation in an hour. And I would say that in the now about 8 or 9 months since that first interview, that perception is, if anything, even strengthened.
That's an interesting word, affection. What's that affection about?
Well, I think it's about a number of things, and certainly there's some degree of that for most institutions in the country. And even the word we use, institution, implies that there's some meaning associated with the organization. And now, you're talking to someone who's an organizational behavior professor. So institution is actually a technical term in sociology that means that people care about something beyond simply what it does on a day-to-day basis. And UNH certainly has that element. And you would see people talk about their days when they were in Durham and, get tears in their eyes. And they would clearly want it to continue to be better and want it to continue to serve the state in the ways that it does. And it is affection. I think that actually is the right word.
What surprised you, President Dean, about UNH, either during your exploration of this job or your first few weeks on the job? And if you could, give us a pleasant surprise and a less than pleasant surprise.
Well, the pleasant surprise, there'd be so many of them. The welcome that I got was incredible from every single person, virtually without exception, in the state, in the Seacoast, in Durham, in the university, in the system, in the legislature. People were incredibly welcoming to me. I didn't really know what to expect. I obviously have no background here whatsoever. I'm kind of a foreigner or a stranger, I suppose. And the welcome was really quite moving and gratifying, and really motivated me to try even harder to try and do a good job for the institution. I know you only asked for one, but the other thing is, from the standpoint of North Carolina, New Hampshire is kind of like one place, and what most people know is candidates tramping around in the snow trying to win the primary. And then when I get here, I see it's this incredibly varied place, with the seacoast and the lakes and the mountains and so on. And the beauty of it is overwhelming.
You've started biking. You've started skiing.
I've been biking for a long time. Yeah. And so I continued biking here, and I really love the routes here. The combination of the woods and the hills and the water views. To say that I'm skiing is gracious. I'm on skis, and I'm probably moving as much as I'm standing still, but that's about as far as I would claim.
Pizza your way down the mountain. Well, President Dean, let's get into some of the nitty-gritty. And as you know, a lot of issues regarding UNH that as much as people have an affection for it, they're frustrated by the high tuition, the student debt, and some other aspects of how the university's been run. So let's jump into it. And first of all, as you know, UNH has among, if not the highest in-state tuition for students. What are your plans to change that?
Yeah, that's true. The UNH has indeed, if you count tuition and fees, among the highest at around $18,000 for in-state tuition. And nationally, there's a very strong correlation between the state funding of an institution and what tuition is. It's a very, very high correlation. And so that's where we start from. And, that comes from the New Hampshire philosophy about not having taxes. So in terms of the percentage of state dollars that the university system gets, we're not really out of line. It's just that the budget of the state is quite small because of the philosophy about taxation. So that's where we start from. Our tuition has actually been increasing very, very slowly over the last few years. I know a lot of listeners have probably read the stories about these double-digit much higher than inflation tuition increases. That's really not the case for us and for the system as a whole. In fact, if you consider financial aid, our net tuition has increased by about 0.5% over the last few years, which is certainly well within inflation, however you measure it. So in real terms, our tuition has actually been going down over the last few years. We have an approval from the board to increase tuition as much as 2.5% for next year. My hope is that we'll find a way not to actually do that and to try and continue to limit even the list price, if you will, tuition. And we're looking, I'm sure we'll talk about this. We're doing some changes in our finance organization to try and make sure that we're getting the most insight that we can about the costs associated with the university. Having said that, UNH is already a very, very efficient organization in terms of administrative costs. And again, listeners may be surprised to find that, but we're incredibly efficient.
So what should be the focus, President Dean? We talked to a panel of state lawmakers, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, state house leaders, and the idea of low state funding came up and high tuition came up. And some of the lawmakers on our panel seem to say, look, we've done our part. It's up to the university system now to lower costs or lower tuition. And there really seemed to be more an emphasis on the individual, helping that individual moderate or low income student rather than broadening the pool and lowering tuition for everybody. Should that be the focus, President Dean, focusing more on that needier student than bringing down the sticker price for all?
Well, I don't know that it's either or. I mean, we have tried to hold the line on tuition increases the last few years, but at the same time, we've really focused, especially on the neediest students, for example, through the Granite Guarantee, which means that the poor students literally pay no tuition during the time that they're at UNH or, for example, at Keene or at Plymouth. The same thing holds. And so, I think we can actually do both.
Do both. So help the neediest students and bring the overall sticker price down.
Right. And we want the overall sticker price down because we'd love to have students come to schools in New Hampshire, including UNH. If you talk to the business people in New Hampshire, and I do quite a bit of that, one of their main concerns is the workforce in New Hampshire. And
that's for
the
sure.
Universities here are where the workforce comes from. So we have a real responsibility to contribute to the prosperity of the state. And the way that we do that is by educating people either, who are from here and stay. But I think it's also worth pointing out that UNH brings thousands of out-of-state students into the state every year. And many of them stay and take jobs in New Hampshire and become lifelong residents. And that's a positive contribution as well.
So you and I can sit here and talk about all the aid that's there for needier students. But if somebody from Massachusetts or Rhode Island or New York goes online and sees that out-of-state, sticker price again, it may be discouraging right from the outset.
It could be, but we still have a fair number of out-of-state students who come. Roughly half of our students come from out of state.
Roughly half, wow.
Yeah, and they're making that choice. So the biggest, not surprisingly, the biggest group of our students from out of state come from Massachusetts, and they could stay in Massachusetts and pay lower tuition there. There's no doubt about that. But there's something about UNH that attracts them that they decide to pay the higher tuition and come. At the same time, I'm sure there's a number of students from New Hampshire who go to UMass and decide to pay the higher tuition there. So it's, certainly tuition and cost drives people's decisions, but it's far from the only thing that drives their decision.
Again, our number here in the exchange is 1-800-892-6477. Send us an email if you'd like, exchange@nhpr.org. Our guest today, UNH President James Dean. And as we're hearing, he's been on the job for just half a year now. He came to UNH from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And President Dean, let's go to our listeners. And Cheryl's calling from Concord. Hi, Cheryl. You're on the air. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
I have a question. I went to UNH. I received my bachelor's degree and master's degree, and my daughter as well, bachelor's and master's degree from
Wow.
UNH. But one of the problems that we both have seen is that there's very little support for students, and we have these huge fees, mostly athletic fees, student activity fees, these types of things. I mean, you're talking like $1,600, I think was the last count of the athletic fees. People like myself, we are going to college to get an education, not to join the gym.
So
it seems like those fees are astronomical, and they should be addressed maybe more so than the actual tuition cost.
Well, thank you for the call, Cheryl. And this actually came up, President Dean. The head of the student government organization also wrote up a very well-written letter talking about some of the key complaints that students have. And there was a feeling also from that group of students that the fees were out of control for what students desired.
Yeah, when I was talking about the total cost before, I was including both tuition and fees. So I was certainly including that. And universities have different philosophies about that, whether they bake the costs into tuition, in which case they're sort of not obvious, or as we do, you put them into fees so they are obvious. We also get, and you read this, we give the undergraduate and the graduate student senate the opportunity to analyze and comment on the fees. So it's a pretty transparent process. If it were not for the fees, of course, our tuition would be even higher. This year, out of concern for that, we decided to not increase any of the fees that students pay. So it's a first step towards trying to get our arms around that. And our overall strategic initiative about building financial strength, one of the things to do is to try and see if we can hold or reduce our cost structure so that we can reduce the increases in fees or maybe even reduce them in the future. Because I agree they are hard. Students actually are happy to pay some of the fees more than others. And, the gym thing that the caller mentioned, there's actually overwhelming support among the student body for the recreation fee because they see that they get a lot of value out of it.
Well, Cheryl, thank you for the call. I appreciate it. And, listening to you talk about finances, President Dean, and I know from your speech and so forth that you're really giving a hard look at how financial operations are run at UNH. That stems from your background in business. You actually wrote a book recently about businesses and universities and that link that sometimes doesn't happen. We often hear from politicians that government and universities would be better off if they were run like a business. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think certainly that there are elements of business that make a lot of sense in universities. And, I grew up in a business school, so I'm certainly no stranger to business. The key thing so the book is actually meant for business people who are trying to help universities. And the working title is something like Inside Universities, a guide for business people trying to help us get better. We'll change the title, but it's something like that. And I think there are many, many things that business people can do to help us. And if you look around the country, there's hundreds of thousands of business people on boards of universities and colleges and so on. And we as university leaders have not done a good job in helping them to understand what our unique challenges are. It's obviously a complicated subject because I wrote a whole book about it. But I would say at the core of it is that businesses are for-profit entities, and any decision that they make ultimately can be reduced to profit, whether you're talking about market share or innovation or what have you. Universities don't have that luxury. Universities have no single goal that's equivalent to profit. So we have a mandate to educate students. We have a mandate to serve the state. We have a mandate to conduct research, improve the quality of life. We have local and state and national issues. And so we have many, many constituencies, and we're trying to help all of them. And that leads to decisions taking longer, which is one of the things that frustrates business people.
All right. Well, hence the word uni, right? University. It means all things, or at least a lot of things. So we'll take a lot more calls after a short break. Again, Cheryl, thank you for that one. The phone number for you to join us with President Dean is 1-800-892-6477. And coming up, we'll get more into President Dean's vision for the future of UNH that he outlined last week. Stay with us.
This is NHPR, and as new resources are marshaled to address New Hampshire's opioid epidemic, NHPR continues its Crossroads reporting project with a live taping of the exchange to examine the issues at stake. Join us at the Nashua Public Library on February 7th at 6:30. Get your free tickets at nhpr.org/events. Support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and from the New England Tap House Grill in Hooksett, offering a rotating selection of 48 craft beers on tap, many from local brewers, plus a beer club and mobile app to check what's on tap. And Colonial Theatre in Keene presenting International Guitar Night on Saturday, February 9th. Tickets at thecolonial.org. Sunny across New Hampshire for today. High temperatures, lower teens, northern parts of the state ranging to mid-20s in the south. It'll be clouding up tonight, lows from negative single numbers in the north country ranging lower teens in southern parts of the state. This is NHPR.
This is The Exchange. I'm Laura Knoy. Today, UNH's new president, James Dean, is with us, and we're covering a lot of ground, including his vision to make UNH, as he puts it, among the nation's top public higher education institutions. Let's get you into our conversation. Send us an email, exchange@nhpr.org, especially if you have connections to UNH, as our last caller did. As a student, as a parent of a student, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-892-6477. Email exchange@nhpr.org. Respond on Facebook or Twitter if you'd like. It's NHPR Exchange. And along with listening today, you can watch our show on Facebook Live. And President Dean, let's jump right into it. That speech you gave late last week saying we will transform UNH into one of the top 25 public universities in the country in the most important measures of academic performance. Couple questions out of that, President Dean. What are those most important measures of academic performance?
Well, I would start with graduation. Graduation and retention is really important. If students don't graduate, they generally don't get the benefits of the education that they've paid for. So it's important. Our graduation rate is pretty good now, but it could certainly be better. And we have a lot of initiatives that we've started just in the last year to try and improve that further. Certainly student success coming out of the university. Many students come to the university to try and transform their economic prospects. There's now measures of that, people who have measured parents' income and graduates' income, and we're looking to try and be among the top universities for helping students to continue to move up the economic ladder. That would be one. Life satisfaction is also important. I think a university education should plant the seeds for people to live not just a productive and healthy life, but a happy life. And we have measures of that actually show we're doing pretty well already, but we'll be focusing on that. On the research side, are we really making a difference? Are we doing research that changes the world and that people are willing to fund based on that? So those would be a few things.
Yeah, and I'm glad you present a broad array of items because 3, 4, or 5 years ago, there was some concern among university leaders that the federal government was heavily focused on this cost issue and was really just looking at, how many people graduate and how much money they make. And is that really an effective way to measure happiness by how much money each graduate makes? Maybe somebody wants to be a history teacher, but they go into, computer science because they make more money and they're miserable every day. So I'm glad to hear you lay out a broad array of measures of success.
Well, thank you for that. And different students come for different reasons, and they have different life aspirations. And sure, you're right. If someone wants to become a social worker and do tremendous good for society over generations, we're not in a position to say, no, you shouldn't do that. You should go do something to make more money. On the other hand, someone comes from, let's just put it this way, a poor family, and their goal in life is to try and make some money and maybe to support their family. And this isn't hypothetical. I've had students in my office hours who say, a young man who said, my goal in life is to make enough money so that my mother doesn't have to work. So we're not going to tell that young man that money's not important. So whatever the goals that students have, whether they're economically focused or whether they're sort of more changing the world focused or some combination of the two, we want to be able to support them.
So again, that bold aspiration, as you called it in your speech, to really put UNH in a top tier, a higher tier than it is now. What's preventing UNH from being in that group right now, President Dean? What's holding UNH back?
I don't think anything's holding us back. I think we're going to do it. I think, I mentioned earlier how much I appreciated the affection and dedication and loyalty of the people in the university community. And I think as we continue to mobilize them, we're going to see some great results. I mean, just this year, over a couple of weeks, we were able to organize 40 students to go back to their high schools and talk to the people in their high schools about how great UNH is. And that's based on a small amount of effort, relatively speaking. That may be 400 students next year. I think that people are ready and willing to help, and we literally just need to ask.
So you're not asking the state for more money to help you achieve this bold vision of vaulting UNH in the top tiers?
Well, we have a request to the state this year on both the capital side and the operations side, but those requests were in place before the strategic plan. Of course, we're always asking the state for help. And we've had some pretty good signals that we may be able to get a bit more support this year, mostly one-time support, on the capital side and the operating side, but the two aren't particularly tied together right now.
The capital side, again, is physical improvements, buildings and grounds and so forth.
Yes, thank you.
Let's go back to our listeners. And Hassan is calling from Manchester. Hi, Hassan. You're on the air. Welcome.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. Go ahead.
I just wanted to know what President Dean's plans were for UNH Manchester and how that kind of folds into the top 25 plan.
I am so glad you called, Hassan, because I did want to ask you, President Dean, about UNH Manchester. Let's not forget, they're under your purview as well.
Right. Well, we have 3 campuses at UNH, the one in Durham that everybody thinks about. We also have UNH Manchester, and then we also have the law school in Concord, so 3 different campuses. And I was just in Manchester, maybe it was last week or the week before, meeting with the Chamber of Commerce board there, including the mayor. And we're very bullish on our relationship with Manchester. We've made a lot of investments there. We're tied into the Army project there. We have a new Milliard Scholars program there to help people work in the regenerative area. So it's something that's really important to us. It's a part of the university, just like any part. I would say maybe one exception is that Manchester is more business dense than most of the other parts of the state. And so we're working on creating a business advisory council that includes a number of businesses from the Manchester area to try and make sure that we're meeting their needs. I think that what Dean Mike DeSalle has done at UNH Manchester is really impressive, and I see a lot of upside going forward.
Do you see a different type of student and program at UNH, and how separate and alike are UNH Manchester and UNH Durham? Because it seems to me they're different entities, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. Or different approaches or philosophies?
Well, I think we have more non-traditional students, if you will, at UNH Manchester. They tend to be a little bit older. They tend to be working. A lot of them are transfer students coming from the community colleges or elsewhere. So, yeah, the student body is a little bit different there. But our goals for them are certainly to help them to fulfill their life goals, again, economically and beyond. So wherever they've come from, we're very, very happy to have them as students. And the higher education marketplace, if you will, is really much more diverse than people think. And so across the country, non-traditional students, that is to say not 18-year-olds who just graduated from high school, are a really big and important part of the market for higher education, not just in New Hampshire, but around the country. And I'm really happy that UNH Manchester does such a great job of serving them.
You mentioned UNH Law also in Concord, and some people might not realize that is also under your jurisdiction. What are the benefits, President Dean, of having a law school associated with the state's big flagship university? And how common is that, by the way?
No, I'm not sure about how common it is. Many states have law schools, and probably most of them have one associated with the flagship. I haven't ever gone back and counted, but that's a really good point.
Because it's relatively new for us here in New Hampshire.
Right. Right, exactly. But the benefits are that, obviously, we live in a society that's based on laws, and we're very fortunate and privileged to be able to live in a society based on laws. And if you're going to have a society based on laws in which conflicts are worked out based on the legal framework, then you need to have experts in how that works, and those are the attorneys. Also, the law school, which was Franklin Pierce and is now part of UNH, has produced a lot of public servants over the years and people who go into politics, judges, and so on. And we think that's just a really important pathway that we want to try and be part of.
Well, you're right. UNH Law, formerly Franklin Pierce, was well regarded in the country. How much do you see UNH right now, President Dean, taking full advantage of the fact that it has this pretty well-regarded law school? Is there more that you could be doing with UNH Law?
Sure, there's always more. We now have people from UNH Law are starting to teach classes in our undergraduate program. That's certainly one way to take advantage of it. UNH Law has an incredibly great reputation in intellectual property, and we're starting to find a way to leverage that through online programs and through residential programs and so on. I think there's a lot of upside here. Here's where I'm probably going to play the card that I've only been here for 6 months, and there's a lot more to do.
All right. Well, I won't ask you the Durham-Concord question right now, maybe 6 months down the line when you're a little more familiar. And I do want to ask you about online education because that's a growing component. But first, back to our listeners, President Dean. Again, you can send us an email if you'd like, exchange@nhpr.org. Respond on Facebook or Twitter @NHPR Exchange. You can watch us on Facebook Live today, too, if you'd like, or you can give us a call, 1-800-892-6477. Up next is Peggy in Dunbarton. Hi, Peggy. Go ahead. You're on the air. Welcome.
Hi, and President Dean, I'm so excited that you're in New Hampshire. to use your phrase, I'm a wicked proud alumna of Chapel Hill. And I've been fortunate to be on campus multiple times a year. I was at Chancellor Folt's installation, and I have followed her leadership and her direction with a lot of admiration over the last several years. And obviously you worked very closely with her and had to implement a lot of those new directions. And one of the initiatives that I've been most interested in reading about is her Arts Everywhere initiative, which has seemed to be an approach to decompartmentalize what by nature is compartmentalized, as a university often is. And I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how that might have expanded learning for students and just in general an interdisciplinary approach across different programs.
Peggy, thank you for the question. Go ahead, President Dean.
Well, I'm surprised to get a question about UNC Chapel Hill, but that's fine. So let me take that a little bit in the direction of the arts at UNH, and that's something I feel very strongly about. We have a very strong arts program, and I'm a big fan of the arts. I play the clarinet and actually sat in with the pep band at a hockey game a couple of months ago. That was a lot of fun. My wife and I are big patrons of the arts, especially theater, and so we've been to several plays already at UNH, one musical and one drama, just tremendously well done. We've been to concerts already. And also through the really yeoman efforts of my wife, we now have student art displayed really all over our house, both paintings and ceramics. And as soon as we get the approval from the students, we tweet about it and put it on Instagram. And, I really believe in trying to incorporate arts into education and into life as a whole. And I think I'm still struggling with exactly how I can best support the arts. We certainly have an opportunity around the Paul Center where we do performing arts. That's not something that's as good as it should be for a university of our caliber, and we're going to see what we can do about that. But I also just today a message is going out from me about the strategies, but also mentioning, as I do each month, the book that I've written. And this month, the book that I'm mentioning is written by one of our history professors. So whether it's literature or music or art or drama, I really feel very strongly about the arts and intend to really support them as well as I can over the next few years.
Earlier, you mentioned an online component to education at UNH, and many schools, of course, are adding online components to their on-campus learning. Whether it's watching the professor deliver a lecture, so much of education is done online already, not just at the university level. You were very involved in this at UNC Chapel Hill. What's the status now of online learning at UNH, President Dean? How would you describe it?
I think that we've got our toe in the water, maybe a little bit more than that. There certainly are some online programs. I don't think we've really fully exploited the potential of online learning. And I'm literally in conversations with Provost Wayne Jones as recently as last night talking about what we can do to further online education. I think the important thing, one important thing for listeners to understand is that there's been a considerable amount of research now on the effectiveness of online education vis-a-vis classroom education, and that the most straightforward way to explain the results is that done well, online education can be just as effective as classroom education. And in fact, if you combine the two, you get something that's probably better than either one of them. So I think you can expect us to make further investments in online education over the next few years. What's the right way to do it and the not right way to do it? Well, the not right way to do it is just to videotape a professor giving lectures and force people to watch them. That's no fun. It's not, and going beyond just the online thing, there's also been a lot of research on evidence-based teaching approaches, and I mentioned those in my talk last week. We have a lot of evidence now that straight lecturing is in most cases not the most effective way for students to learn.
Chalk and talk.
Right. Based on the research, you can't really make the argument anymore that that's the most effective way. Now, some faculty are brilliant lecturers, and there's a place for that, certainly. But if we want students to learn, we really have to focus on more high-impact learning practices. And interestingly, the research shows that first-generation college students like me, benefit differentially from not lecturing and from having high engagement in the learning process. So we're going to be taking a really hard look at that as well.
How concerned are you, President Dean, that there's pressure to put more university education online just as a cost-saving measure?
I haven't seen a lot of that yet. People believe that you're going to save a lot of money doing that. You don't save as much money as people think you do.
Really?
Yeah, because you can't really. I mean, what people think is you're going to take the professors out of it, but the professors are the magic that makes the education happen, and you're just doing it in a different format. I mean, are there some cost savings? Yes, but there's also some technology that you have to add, and you wouldn't do it primarily as a cost-saving thing.
You know, your predecessor, Mark Huddleston, was in that era when, again, the Obama administration especially, lots of attention on student debt, really pressuring colleges and universities to reduce the cost, reduce student debt, add more online components. And I want to read a quote from President Huddleston's State of the University address a couple of years ago. He said, "We should not yield to the pressure to commodify higher education. America can't afford the idea to, quote, throw everything online, substitute call centers for face-to-face interactions, and award competency-based credits for college-level analogs of GED degrees so that all our customers can enjoy everyday Walmart prices." So he was kind of pushing back on this idea that everything can be online, everything can be done in 2 years. Lowering the price is the most important thing.
Mark was a really smart guy. That's a great quote. I may steal that. No, I mean, certainly everything's not going to be online. I certainly don't want it to be commodified. I think that the real work to be done in higher education over the next few years is, with sort of an agnostic approach to exactly how the education is delivered, trying to understand what is it that students need to learn to flourish over the uncertain decades ahead of us, and then what are the educational practices, but teaching and learning practices that will help them to get there. Some of it's going to be online, some of it's going to be in the classroom. Much of it is at a residential university, but outside the classroom. We have many people involved in education at the university who aren't professors.
Let's take another call, President Dean. And Ailish is calling in from Manchester. Ailish, go ahead. You're on the air. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Mr. Dean.
Hi.
I just was wondering what your plan is for student debt, since New Hampshire has one of the lowest state-funded universities in the country and one of the highest debt burdens in the country.
Sure, and that's a question we've been sort of circling around for a while, but go ahead, President Dean, if you want to add anything else there.
Well, I think what we can do is to try and hold down tuition increases and hold down tuition as much as we can, because tuition is one of the big drivers of debt, and also try and do as much as we can around scholarships. In the last campaign, the capital campaign, which was incredibly effective, raising over $300 million, the single biggest category of donations to the university was around scholarships for students to try and lower their costs and therefore lower their debt. So we are on it already for sure.
So focusing on scholarships, focusing on internal financial mechanisms of the university. Are you going to cut programs, President Dean? Get rid of certain majors that just aren't that popular anymore?
Well, it's the responsibility of anybody in a leadership position in a public institution to try and use the public's money and the students' tuition money as effectively as possible. So if we have two different programs, one which has excess demand and we need to hire more professors in order to help meet that need, and another program where we don't have that demand, we're probably going to move money to the place where there's demand. Now, there's limits to that because you can't hire and fire professors on a whim, and you wouldn't ever want to. Again, they're the soul of the university, and you always need to be respectful about that. But neither can you ignore the fact that students are voting with their feet, and you're trying to help them get where they want to go.
Okay. Well, thank you for the call, Ailish. And coming up, I've got a bunch of emails, including another one on the state funding issue, President Dean. Also one about free speech on campus and one about the lack of student and faculty diversity on campus. So we'll cover all that after a short break and keep taking your calls. 1-800-892-6477. Email exchange@nhpr.org. More with UNH President James Dean in just a moment. This is The Exchange on NHPR.
America's longest government shutdown ever is over. But the damage from the stalemate is expected to last for many weeks, and there's no guarantee that those affected won't face being furloughed again. Putting the government back to work. Next time on 1A.
That's This Morning at 10 here on NHPR. Support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and from the City of Claremont, with information about Claremont's shopping, dining, entertainment, and recreation at ClaremontNH.com. And from Morno Law, located in Nashua, focusing on family law, estate planning, probate matters, and more, helping good people through tough times. Learn more at mornolaw.com. Sunshine for today, high temperatures, lower teens, northern parts of the state ranging to mid-20s in southern New Hampshire. This is NHPR.
This is The Exchange. I'm Laura Knoy. Tomorrow on our show, the comeback of the Eagle in New Hampshire. It's an amazing story, and we'll find out more tomorrow on The Exchange. This hour, we're talking with the new president of UNH, James Dean, and we're hearing a lot from you. Your questions and comments about New Hampshire's flagship university are welcome at 1-800-892-6477. Email exchange@nhpr.org, exchange@nhpr.org. You can respond on Facebook or Twitter at NHPR Exchange. And in addition to listening today, you can watch our program on Facebook Live. So, President Dean, getting right back to listeners, and here's an email that came in actually last week from Tracy, who says, I'm a non-traditional transfer student at UNH. Growing up in New Hampshire and later living in more culturally diverse parts of the country, one of the things that has stood out to me upon returning to the area is how uncomfortable the topic of race is here at UNH, which has a predominantly white student body and faculty. Tracy says, with greater public awareness of systemic racism, it seems like the time is ripe to be having a conversation about race on campus. Tracy asks, do you think UNH is doing enough to ensure its graduates leave with understanding things like white privilege and the subversive ways racism is perpetuated in America? Tracy also asks, are there any plans to make the faculty more diverse as a way of setting a precedent for non-white people in positions of leadership? Thanks for those two questions, Tracy. And President Dean, let's take the first one first. Is UNH doing enough to ensure graduates leave, as Tracy says, with an understanding of racism in America?
Well, I think we're doing a lot. I mean, in one of our required English classes, we actually have coverage of that topic and trying to get people to understand different perspectives and points of views. In one of our required English classes, I've been, in my first few months here trying to get my arms around understanding of diversity and how it's experienced on campus. We are doing a climate survey coming up in about a month that's going to actually take the temperature of a lot of students and faculty on campus. And based on the findings there, we're going to be certainly taking some steps. We are actively talking with some firms about supporting scholarship programs that would increase the diversity of the student body on campus. All of our recruiting efforts have a diversity component where we're trying to make sure that we get not only the best person, but that we work really hard to make sure that all people believe that they can be part of our university community. So, I mean, arguably you're never really doing enough, but you keep trying and keep trying to go further. I've had specific sit-downs and lunches with specific groups of students. In particular, I've had lunch with student athletes of color. I've had lunch with Chinese students. I've had lunch with trans students. I have a lunch coming up with faculty and staff of color across the university. And each time I do that, I learn a lot more, and we try to respond accordingly.
Why is diversity important for a campus community?
Well, the Supreme Court has actually weighed in on that.
Yeah, it's a controversial topic.
It was. And at UNC, we had the joy of being sued by the same organization that sued Harvard. So I've actually had my time in the well on this issue. And the Supreme Court says that the educational benefits of diversity are an ironclad rationale for universities to make sure that we have a diverse student body. And I feel good about that. I mean, our students, when they go out into the work world, are going to be working with all kinds of different people. And if they go to a university for 4 years and they only see people like themselves, and then they go out into the work world and they see an explosion of different kinds of people, we're probably not serving them as well as we can.
So the U.S. Supreme Court is kind of backing up this concept that diversity is important and something that universities should seek to achieve?
Yeah, they wouldn't quite go that far. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure I want to quote it exactly.
We'll throw that to UNH law.
But the point is that the idea of increasing the diversity on campus has been recognized by the Supreme Court as an admissible element in admissions decisions. And so that one among many factors can be diversity in making decisions about admission. And that has been recently challenged by Students for Fair Admission. So we'll see where it turns out.
I've spent time, President Dean, on the campuses of Franklin Pierce University in Rindge, spoke there a year or two ago, spoke at New England College in Henniker a couple years before that. And both of those campuses, admittedly they're private colleges, seem to have been able to attract a more diverse student background than UNH. And I just wonder why you think that is. I know you're new to the state, but do private institutions have an easier time doing this? Is it something about UNH in particular? Just wonder what your thoughts are.
I don't know. It's a really good question. Private universities maybe sometimes have more money to try and have scholarship programs for minority students. That could be part of it. Private universities do have the same legal framework that public universities do in terms of admission, so it's probably not that. I'd really have to see the data there. I mean, historically, private universities have really struggled to try and have diversity, so it's interesting that observation.
What's your pitch, President Dean, to a young African-American living in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, about why they should come to UNH, recognizing that they'd still be in a pretty small minority on campus? Mm-hmm. And there have been, ugly reports over recent years about racist incidents.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they'll have a great experience, and we're working hard to make the experience better all the time. I really made it a point to be connected with a lot of our young minority students, and to show them that I care about them and that the university cares about them. I can't change the fact that New Hampshire is an overwhelmingly white state. That's not going to change anytime soon. But what we can do at UNH is to try and make sure that, and this is part of my first goal about student success and well-being, is that every single student feels welcome and feels that they can fulfill their potential at UNH, and that's our aspiration. And there's a lot of really terrific people at UNH who have been working a long time to make that happen. Sometimes, a single incident or a single anecdote gets a lot of press, but that's not really the lived experience of people on a day-to-day basis. Just recently, tragically, we had a young first semester African-American student die. She had blood clots and died over the Christmas vacation. And I went to both her funeral and the memorial ceremony on campus, and it was in Huddleston Hall, and the outpouring of support for her transcended the African-American community. And I think it was really a symbol of the campus coming together about someone whom we simply loved. It didn't really matter what color she was. And that, I think, is us at our best.
Well, Tracy, thank you for the email. I appreciate you bringing it up. And here's another one that came in last week. This is from Michael, who says, in 2015, under your predecessor, the university was subjected to national criticism when it published a language guide on its website, which listed words like American, Caucasian, and homosexual as problematic and recommended these words be avoided. This was part of a broader national conversation about freedom of speech on campus and a perception of, quote, liberal culture run amok on campus. Michael says, if the primary purpose of the university is learning, as stated in its mission statement, what steps has the university taken to protect the free exchange of ideas and speech on campus, which is critical in the distillation of the truth? This is a concern that comes up a lot. President Dean, more conservative members of our society feel that there is a liberal culture on campus.
Well, there's a couple of different issues that are sort of intertwined there. Is there a liberal culture on campus is one thing, and free speech rights is something entirely different. The document that you're talking about was several years, I think, before I got here.
Yes,
my
2015, he says, yeah.
I mean, my understanding is that was never university policy. So that was some individual person's or department's idea.
So sort of a draft that got amplified.
Right. So, and this is what I'm talking about in terms of anecdotes that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, as opposed to, the overwhelming position of the university. So I know from speaking to him and from his decisions that President Huddleston was very, very strong on First Amendment rights. We had a group come and speak last spring on campus that was not by any stretch of the imagination a liberal group, and President Huddleston defended their right to speak and protected them. And there were a lot of students who were unhappy that we had them speak, and they spoke. And that is my approach as well. In doing the research for the book that I wrote, I confirmed my understanding that public universities have really stringent requirements on free speech rights. And basically, there's very little that anyone could ever do legally to constrain speech on campus. There's time and place and all that. And that's how I feel anyway. I mean, as my colleagues always say, the cure for bad speech is not no speech, it's more speech.
All right. Well, thank you for the email, Michael. And let's go back to the callers. And Jim is calling from Manchester. Hi, Jim. You're on the air. Welcome.
Good morning. My question is twofold, but connected, I think. One has to do with the future and the vision for University of New Hampshire in Manchester, and I would ally that or connect that to Mr. Dean's comments last week about one of his areas of action was cooperation with and involvement in high schools in the state. So I'd particularly be interested in his intentions for University of New Hampshire, Manchester, and how that institution and his institution more broadly might work with the Manchester public schools, the largest public schools in the state.
Okay, Jim, thanks a lot for the call.
Well, we talked about Manchester a little while ago, and I talked about how important that is for us and how the students are a little bit different, but we try to help them as much as we can, and we're very, very proud of that effort. In terms of working with high schools, I also mentioned that we've started sending students out to high schools. We have a number of faculty who have already raised their hands and said they would be happy to go and represent UNH in various high schools. I'm hoping to be able to speak with principals and with counselors at high schools and to connect, to make that connection as well. And of course, through our educational programs, we're already connected a lot to high schools in New Hampshire. But I would like to continue to make that an even stronger link.
You said in your speech last week, President Dean, that you wanted to make UNH the first choice of New Hampshire's top-tier high school students. And as you know, that's not happening right now. I came across a number just recently, came from reporting from WMUR using Federal Department of Education data. New Hampshire had the highest percentage of college-going high school graduates leave the state to attend college than any other. More than 59% of New Hampshire high school graduates left the state. So clearly it's not the first choice of New Hampshire high school students now. How do you change that? And why do you think that that is the case?
Well, I think we continue to make the universities better. And when you're talking about that statistic, obviously it applies to all of the universities in the state, not just UNH. So we continue to work to make all of our universities better, whether they're in the university system or the community colleges or what have you. And then second, I think we tell our story better. We continue to get out on a one-on-one basis and talk to students. For example, so I've had office hours with students this year, which has been really helpful in helping me understand their concerns. And they tell me that the counselors in their high schools say, don't go to UNH because it's just like going to high school. It'll be all the same people.
I've got teenagers, and believe me, I've heard that more than once. It's just like going to Keene High or Concord High or wherever.
Right. But, I mean, if you think about it for even 10 seconds, that's just not true. I mean, people are coming from all over the state to begin with. They're coming from all over New England, and they're coming from literally all over the country and the world. So what we need to do is to go out into the high schools and make sure that the students hear from us and from the students, from our students. Because when I ask the students, so is that true? They go, no, it's not true. So we've got these old sort of narratives that are playing, and we need to replace them with the new and truer narratives about what it's actually like to be at UNH today.
Some high school counselors say, apply to UNH as your safety school. So again, how do you change that narrative from UNH is your safety school in case you don't get in anywhere else to UNH is your first choice?
Pretty much the answer that I just gave.
Yeah.
We need to continue to make the university better, and we need to tell our story more effectively. There are students here who have been, or alumni who have come here and have done extraordinarily well. Whether it's in business or engineering or finance or government, you can be whatever you want to be coming to UNH, and I think that's the message that students need to get.
Again, our number is 1-800-892-6477. Email exchange@nhpr.org. Again, exchange@nhpr.org. Getting back to the idea of if you could lower the cost, it might make it more appealing. I do know people who have sent their kids to Massachusetts, Vermont, close by, and it has been cheaper due to scholarships and so forth. A group of faculty unions from all the universities in New Hampshire, all the public universities, got together in January earlier, talked about a critical juncture for higher education. Reading a little bit from their notes here, President Dean, we find ourselves imperiled by declining public funding, misguided priorities, and soaring costs. And they say they hope to collaborate to find ways to serve the common interests of our students and communities. The group will be reaching out to state officials in February to advocate for, quoting here, significantly improve state support for the education of New Hampshire students. Will you be part of that, President Dean, a push to significantly increase state support that these faculty members are going to be behind?
Well, I mean, this is something that's an initiative of faculty. Did you say the faculty unions?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're really independent actors. We don't get in the way of anything that they do. We can't and don't get in the way of what they do. Would we like to have increased funding? Sure, we like to have increased funding. But, we're aware there's lots of priorities that the state has. And so we don't generally take, and the we here is the system, because it's the system that's funded, not the individual universities. We try to take a realistic and sober approach to what we can do, respectful of people making hard decisions.
So when the budget hearings begin, and they'll begin soon, if they're not already beginning.
Already beginning.
What are you going to say about the university's share of the state budget?
Well, I probably am not going to be the main person who's asked about that. I mean, that would probably be Chancellor Leach as the head of the system. And again, as I talked about before, the university's share of the state budget is not as out of line as people might like to think it is. It's just that the state budget is so small. Now, this year, the state is doing a little bit better in terms of revenues, but as the governor has said, you can't spend one-time revenues over and over and over again. You can only spend them once. So we are trying to work closely with the legislature and with the governor and with the commissioners to try and understand what can be done. We've gotten very positive signals from the legislature and from the governor about what they might put in the budget this year. We don't know for sure, of course, and as you said, there's hearings ahead. But what we want to do is to get to a respectful working relationship among everyone based on an understanding that UNH and the universities in the system really add a great deal to the prosperity of the state.
I want to ask you very quickly, President Dean, please, about the Thompson School, which, as you know, until recently offered several 2- and 4-year agricultural degrees. Some of those are now being eliminated, others folded into other parts of the university. UNH has cited declining enrollment, the basic math, not enough people sign up for these courses, so it doesn't make financial sense to offer them. Why do you think more UNH students aren't choosing these degrees?
Well, I think that they're mostly 2-year degrees, and there's just a tremendous amount of competition for those students. There's a limited number of students, and we have a very strong community college system, for example, and other ways that you can get capabilities or 2-year degrees in that area. And just as you said, we can't afford to lose money on these programs or really on any programs for a significant period of time. We try to focus on the kinds of things that students are looking for, and apparently students aren't looking to UNH to provide those things. In the areas, I do want to say, however, that our support for agriculture is part of our DNA, starting with Thompson from the very beginning, gave us basically his farm to start the university on. And we continue to have very strong programs. As I drive here to Concord from Durham, I drive past all the horses and cows and tunnels that they grow. I mean, I had produce over the weekend that came from Colsa, from the College of Life Sciences and Agriculture. So we're very, very strong in that area. There are a few areas where students just aren't showing up, and in those areas you can't offer a program that students don't want.
All right. Well, President Dean, come back in about 6 months and we'll talk again. We'll get into a lot more detail, but I really appreciate you being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
That's UNH President James Dean. Again, he's been at the head of the university for about half a year. He came to UNH from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he was a vice chancellor, a provost, and a professor. He was also dean of UNC's Business School. Remember, our conversation always continues online, on Facebook, and at nhpr.org. The Exchange is a production of NHPR. The engineer today is Emily Quirk. Our senior producer is Ellen Grimm. Our producers are Jessica Hunt and Christina Phillips. Our theme music was composed by Bob Lord, and I'm Laura Knoy.